So this document is the leave behind. So you can access this now at any time on your phone. We're going to do some workshopping on this document too. And that's the bit.ly for it. So it's bit.ly upEND x CTRN. And if anyone has any problems accessing, you can come find me afterwards. I'll make sure that you get access to it. So first, I want to extend a huge thank you to the organizers of this convening for inviting me to effectively be a fly on the wall and to learn from this huge repository of movement knowledge that they brought together in this space. As you'll learn in a little bit, this is not my primary organizing sector. So this has been a huge learning opportunity for me from the panels and the individuals I've gotten to meet, and my plate is really full right now. So I just wanted to start by saying thank you. And then the roadmap. So first, we're going to talk a little bit about the how of solidarity and the objective of this workshop. Then I'm going to tell you about a learning experience from CTRN and why we decided to historicize our analysis. Then I'm going to offer a tool because I like tools. And then we're going to try the tool. And hopefully at the end of this, you're going to learn a little bit about how solidarity. But first, some introductions. So as you've already heard, I am one of the co-founders of the Carceral Tech Resistance Network. If you want to find me on Elon Musk's app, that's the only public social that I keep. Go for it. But for more context, so CTRN is a skills and knowledge sharing network that connects grassroots efforts against the design, testing, and deployment of violent technologies. For the past 7 years now, CTRN has supported campaigns in the context of policing, prisons, border enforcement, commercial security, and counter-protest technologies. We advocate for the technology governance needs of systems impacted communities, and we build the long-term capacity of directly impacted communities to self-advocate against technologies like autonomous surveillance vehicles, risk profiling technologies, and automated decision systems. CTRN is made up primarily of femme, Black, immigrant, non-Black POC organizers, most of whom are systems impacted, some of whom are incarcerated, which means we do have inside organizers. So what are we workshopping? Now, I know what some of you are probably thinking. What does all this have to do with family policing? That's a very fair question. Actually, I had the exact same question when I met Connie, Sid, and Josie a few months ago. I'd been incredibly honored that they asked me to facilitate this workshop, but I was also really concerned that I didn't know very much about this domain because this is not my primary domain of organizing. I usually work in policing technology. So I began asking questions that I would usually ask when I was faced with a sector or an organizing domain that I don't have a lot of experience with, which is how does technology show up in family policing? I think that's also a fair question. I mean, it shows up in a myriad of ways, right? You have predictive algorithms like the Allegheny Family Screening Tool that's used throughout child welfare agencies to predict things like the likelihood of child mistreatment, to auto-screen and algorithmically prioritize caseloads. There's data integration and information sharing ecosystems to think about, as well as things like mobile data centers and hardware where case notes from surveilling Black, Brown, Native, and non-Black immigrant youth are inputted into the cloud and can inform a child's future potential and opportunity in immeasurable ways. There's also non-human surveillance systems like CCTV, facial recognition, tagging and location tracking with ankle shackles and digital shackles now on your phone. And there's phone monitoring, mail screening, internet activity. So if I wanted to facilitate a workshop on, say, how to leverage community impact assessments against an automated decision system in the CPS and CPS, or the system that you're struggling against, there's plenty of opportunities to do so. But that didn't feel right because my mandate here was to show you how to create solidarity. And there's something I realized when I got into deeper discussion with the folks on the upEND team. I was thinking about the relationship between my work and yours through a lens of difference and distinction. I was thinking about what skills can I bring from my work into your domain. And that in and of itself started to kind of present a problem. That framework was kind of a problem. And I think I started to think a little bit deeper about what solidarity actually is. And y'all have spent a lot of time in the past 48 hours talking about that. But it can be in a lot of ways. And it shows up in activism and organizing as a feeling, as an action, as a theory, as a practice, as a strategy, as a mindset, as a skill, as a process, as a goal. But the thing is that individually or without deliberate effort, each of these modalities can generate ephemeral, short-lived, and unsustained solidarity, right? Or solidarity that's simply transactional or practical. So basically, I scratch your back, you scratch my back until you're at capacity, because we're always at capacity in every single sector that we're organizing in. And then there's no more backs being scratched, right? Instead, we want to look for mechanisms which bring about the conditions of solidarity with maximum effectiveness. And in this workshop, I'm going to demonstrate a strategy to build solidarity by naming our oppressor. Spoiler alert, that's the entire thing. Okay. So first, I want to talk a little bit about, and this is going to show up a lot better on your screens. And again, you can refer to it afterwards. A little bit about a learning moment at CTRN. And this right here is from a 1969, a 68 Black Panther newspaper printing, and it's about riot computers. And I'm going to tell you in a second why this is a really important document to the organization. So when I started organizing back in 2016, 2017, technology started to show up outside of expert communities in like one of two ways, right? It was either like something that somebody was experiencing, or it was showing up as a new weapon or tool that an agency or a state agency was using. And activists and organizers who are doing the usual work of abolitionist organizing, jail support work, who are doing uh, jail blocking campaigns, who are doing care work of childcare and cooking for bereaving families after police homicide, they started to notice things like, for instance, police patrols started to become a lot more systematic and specifically targeting certain communities, and they started to experience that differently. They started to notice things like surveillance devices, autonomous surveillance devices, like shot spotter devices, and more cameras coming up all over the place. They started to recognize things in their city budget hearings about how money was going towards this and that technology procurement or this and that platform that's supposed to make policing better, smarter, fairer, was one that we heard a lot, especially after the Obama administration, right? And for folks who were doing the everyday work of abolitionist organizing, technology wasn't really like the main focus. But instead, as it started to show up in these spaces that we were, right, we do what we always do. We reach out to our networks, we reach out to lawyers, we reach out to engineers, we reach out to academics. We're like, what's going on here? And the story that we received at the time is kind of interesting, right? The story that we received at the time is that technology is growing, it's expanding. We now have the Internet of Things and big data. And so everything is becoming more and more technological. And so we're like, oh, okay, that's what's happening. All across society, everything is becoming more and more technological. And so it's showing up here. Then around 2018, we did this because we're a community archiving group as well. We did this community archiving project going through collating movement archives that our elders had been holding on to, just movement ephemera, buttons from protests and posters. And some folks had like reams and reams of Black Panther newspapers, and we digitized them so that they can be part of our collective knowledge. And we started to see news like this, an article from 1968 talking about riot policing computers that sound exactly like the kind of computers that the Los Angeles Police Department claims to be using in order to make their policing more efficient, more tactical, less biased, right? And then we're like, well, what's going on? Because not only were they talking about the exact same technologies in the 1960s, in the 1970s, but we start to realize that myth that everything was now all of a sudden way more technological just wasn't true. The border has been digital since 1974, right? Police have had predictive systems since way before then. And so we started to realize that there has been a history of forgetting. We have forgotten our own history of carceral technologies, and yet we claim to be organized against carceral technologies. So we had this pivoting moment where we had to realize that not only have prior generations of organizers dealt with these exact same technologies, but they also have a political analysis of these technologies. They also have a knowledge of how they took apart these technologies. And all of that is no longer in our possession. So we went through this massive historicizing moment where we're like, we need to understand why it is that our analysis of technology is riddled with these moments of unforgetting. So we did this shift in our analysis, and we started to what I'm just calling, for the sake of this workshop, name our oppressors, but you can call it whatever you want. We can come up with a clever name together at the end if you want. But basically, we start to understand that these moments of forgetting and like basically going back through the history of computing, the history of um, predictive analytics, the history of even simple things like fingerprint systems, right? And try to really understand that this is not a moment in time, but rather this is a long standing history. We start to recognize something very, very specific, which is empire tells its own story, not just us telling our stories, but empire tells its own story with very powerful propaganda that turns into common sense notions. And one of these narratives is a forgetting that the world we live in, the empire that we live in and are in the center of, is less than 300 years old. And that's really, really important to recognize, because sometimes when we talk about structures of violence, when we talk about systems of violence, we talk about them in very, very abstract, naturalized terms, like they're planets or like physics, right? But this is a specific empire that is less than 300 years old, right? And that empire has a cultural violence that has very specific attributes and characteristics and practices that calcify over time, which means that it can be an object of study. And eventually, those practices are respun as natural social phenomenon or institutions that are inevitable. But again, it's not. It's 300 years old, right? Some of us come from civilizations that are thousands of years old. Some of our communities have lived, loved, thrived, even hurt and done harm and enacted violence and warfare in ways that do not resemble the kinds of violence that our communities are facing here. And I think that's really important. So we name it. We name Anglo-American Empire. We name that this empire enacted through land capture, enacted through enslavement, enacted through natal alienation, enacted through very specific kinds of bureaucratic violence and genocidal violence and racialized violence, and how that history has evolved over time, right? And we named that in 78 years ago, the territorial identity of that empire dramatically changed, right? When that empire center shifted here to the so called United States. And those practices then became globalized in ways that the world hadn't seen before. And one of those practices is computing. It's Anglo American computing, which is the technology that was developed here. It scaffolded our war economy. And as James Boggs tells us, that's that very war economy whose surplus capital the American government used to justify not giving us the welfare state that every other European state got, right? So computing and computing technologies aren't just incidentally violent. They don't sometimes just show up in violence, but rather their very DNA being produced at the center of empire is one of violence. And understanding in that way really shifts who our target is. It's not specific technologies, it's rather empire itself. And that's the moment of solidarity. I'm going to try and kind of explain that first conceptually, then through a demonstration, and then we're going to go to the tool. Okay, so this is something that I wrote in the blurb of this workshop. Carceral welfare systems do not disproportionately target Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities because of a shared or inherent vulnerability. They do so because eugenics and population control have deep roots in imperial violence, right? It's exactly like Kelly told us. There are specific cultures and institutions of violence that have evolved over time. And when you start to track, for instance, how risk assessment technologies, very similar to the ones that decide whether or not you're an online extremist, resemble the exact same paper-based risk assessment technologies that they used to vet the patriotism of Japanese Americans that they had just interned but now needed their bodies for fodder in the Korean War. That's the lineage of that technology, right? When you look at the way in which database systems measure bodies in workplaces and how that shows up and breaks bodies in Amazon warehouses, and the long history of doing that exact same kind of tabulation in a plantation context, then you understand the specific history of violence, right? You also understand how, when you look back into the BIA records, the Bureau of Indian Affairs records, and you start to see measurements of how much food the US federal government allocated to Native communities to make sure that they were just hungry enough not to protest, and how those same calculations and algorithms are used to determine how we allocate food aid globally, right? Long history of empire, same techniques, same tools refined over time. So the tool or the technique, right? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah. So the tool or the technique. So, it's a diagnostic exercise basically. It's really, really simple, but it's about how to expand your way of thinking about what your target is outside of that very, very specific focus to yourself. But I wanted to take a second to mention like how we're living through a moment where we see how powerful naming our shared oppressor can be, right? We're like more than a year into to the most recent genocide being committed by the Zionist state. And over the past 12 months, I've seen incredible cross-sector organizing and folks whose tactics don't usually agree, right? Come together and everybody from wherever they are doing what they need to do because they recognize the enemy, rather the oppressor is the same, right? I'm talking about how staffers who work on Congress walk out, and also people strap themselves to ships to prevent armaments from being shipped. And those two individuals who in many, many other contexts wouldn't see themselves in the same struggle, see themselves in the same struggle. So we are living through proof evidence that this is a very effective way to cut through and subordinate tensions when it comes to like disagreements about what the tactic is, disagreement about what the work is, what the capacity is that we're supposed to invest in. If we recognize that the enemy is the same, the oppressor is the same, then it cuts through a lot of that. So the way that you basically do this exercise, and so for us, how that showed up for us is instead of thinking about specific technologies, you think about what the work is that these technologies are doing. And a modified version of this can be done for family policing, and we're going to do that, but let's work through this case study first. So you begin with an inventory of what your organizing shows up as. What work are you doing to fight, struggle against, and care despite the system of violence that you're targeting? And then you expand the analysis of it to identify its relation to empire. And up until now, I'm sure this sounds like super, super theoretical, but this becomes very grounded, very empirical, very contextualized, very, very, very quickly. So the example I'm going to use is in the context of technology justice organizing, the fight against predpol. Predpol, for those of you who don't know, is one of the technologies that emerged after a 2009 NIJ grant was allocated to a handful of cities in the United States in order to develop complex predictive policing systems so that they could identify where crime is. And that NIJ grant has been connected to military functions because at the time, of course, there were surges happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so they needed to find a domain to test and develop those technologies. And they used policing sites like Los Angeles, like Chicago, to do that. And so they developed a bunch of predictive or policing experiments. Predpol was one of them. So the question is, what work is the target doing? What work is Predpol doing? It's zoning, it's mapping, it's territorializing, right? And it's doing it in a way that is very familiar in the longer arc history of empire. It's doing it in a way, the work that it's doing is the work of banishment. So this is a project of an organization I used to work with called Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. And I really recommend you spend some time with this because this is a fascinating demonstration of how you can start to identify who your natural allies are in fights, right? So algorithms in policing versus who shows up when you change the story of what the target really is. What ended up happening in this specific campaign was they did a FOIA request and they got a bunch of force allocations, so patrol allocations from Predpol used by the Los Angeles Police Department, and they mapped it. And they started to realize that there's really weird overlaps between the LA Arts District redistricting and Skid Row redistricting and where the patrol was being reallocated to and where there was the forced concentration of patrols. And what started off as a technology-specific campaign turned into a campaign that immediately involved housing advocates, immediately involved folks fighting against the commercial real estate sector, and the people who started to show up in City Hall hearings about Predpol came from those fights. It became a natural understanding that this is our fight too, because this is how this technique of empire is showing up. So while and this is from the report that the community wrote up, while more and more people are beginning to understand the role of data in policing, less attention is being paid to data-driven policing's relationship to land. Their exploration of that connection began as they were researching whether algorithmic generated predictive hotspots had a role in LAPD's murder of Skid Row resident Charlie Africa Quang. The research recovered an ecology of institutions who inform police violence, including real estate developers, advocacy nonprofits, academics, and the U.S. military. So what started off again was like a 7-person campaign who was just nerding out over police data. All of a sudden became a cross-sector fight. And that's exactly the exercise right there. When you move away from what your specific target is and you understand it in the broader context of what the imperial technique is, then you start to recognize who are your natural allies in this fight. And they show up for you. And they show up self-motivated. So it's not a I scratch your back, you scratch my back. It's we're in this very much together. Any questions before we jump into trying it together? Anything coming up for folks? Okay. So to try it, I'm going to sit back and let you teach me a little bit about family policing and begin by naming some of your strategies and targets. Again, what are you doing to fight, struggle against, and care despite the system of violence that you're targeting? And you could just yell them out. I'm going to write them out here. Say more. What does that show up as? Sorry. I promise I know how to type. What else? Say more. What is that? Thank you, Jason. Thank you. What else?
Educating, dependency 101 process, giving an overview of what the system, what a parent is going to go through when they enter the system from the time of the 72 hours and then all the way up to termination.
Did you call that dependency 101?
Dependency 101.
Educating and empowering. Okay. Is that right? Dependency? Perfect. Yes, we can. Yes, we can. Yeah, please. I'm sorry, Jason. Dedicated lawyers. So, like, building up legal resources, right?
Yeah, we need that help. I think we are out here busting myths. Also training judges and attorneys.
So one of the things, 2 things are coming up. In empowering and educating parents and busting myths, there seems to be narrative work, right? So there's a problematic narrative that you're trying to fix. One more time.
Shaming or discrediting. Is that a strategy or a target? I think that's a target. Well, I think it pops up.
How about does this make sense? Shaming or discrediting the narratives of directly impacted people. Yeah, and exactly that's what we're trying to contradict, right? Uplifting voices. Okay. Yeah. So that seems like kind of like before they get caught up in the system, right? Giving them the tools and the techniques that is that a kind of preventative move? Tell me more.
I think another target is criminalization.
Say more.
Because one of the things that we notice in dealing with a lot of our members is that CPS cases can tend to turn criminal cases, and it will help actually become something that helps strengthen the CPS case.
Yeah.
And then at times, a CPS case would be developed if there is a certain criminal case, like in New York, if you have a drug case, you'll get a CPS case, and then that CPS case would then make that drug case just a little bit more harder to fight. So it's the way that these systems kind of utilize each other to self sustain each other and make each other seem credible, while then like decreasing our credibility. And I think it's different than just discrediting and criminalizing. Discrediting is making it seem like you can't afford to do any of these things. You're unable, or just unable to care for, or anything like that. Criminalization is then saying you are really a bad person and you deserve to be in jail.
So you start. Oh, sorry. Go. Oh, that's good.
Culturally competent. Yeah.
So you kind of start to see how when you start, because it's much easier to start naming the work that you're already doing, right? Like that's just going to be accessible. You start naming, what do I do on a daily basis as an organizer, as an activist in this space, as someone who's directly impacted? How do I take care of my community, right? Then you start to see how the relationship between the tactics and strategies that you're using starts to draw out those targets, right? Because that's what we're ultimately going to be mining for in the table is the targets. But let's start kind of teasing out, and you can name either targets or strategies if you want, but let's start teasing out more and more targets that we're seeing. So this criminalization one is kind of interesting because what you're saying is that these two systems, the criminal legal system and CPS, are just mutually reinforcing. And that's a structural fact that everybody knows, right? Is that kind of what you're saying? They're like,
And this has happened in every other system itself, that works with the criminalization system. Well, the law enforcement system, even mental health services, they do the same type of things. Domestic services, they do the same type of things. But specifically CPS, they have an automatic like relationship to automatically report and call in the police to again criminalize somebody around minor things, like super minor things. And then even the court system will automatically call CPS in again if you have like a drug case or anything like that. They'll automatically call CPS in to develop an investigation on you, strengthening those cases. And I think that that's something that really needs to be highlighted, is that once you have a CPS case while under a criminal investigation, it makes it worse. And then once you have a criminal investigation under a CPS case, it makes it worse.
So this is I'm gonna harp on this one because it's like it's triggering something for me. This is really interesting because it these tight relationships, again, remember what I said about how sometimes it can seem inevitable, right? You're just sharing information. They're not, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
in order for files to be interoperable,
Yeah.
that's a technological somebody had to digitize those documents, digitize those forms, make it so those databases talk to each other. And that's not just legal, that's literally engineering work. And so which agencies are talking to each other very very closely, exactly, like that's a target, right? And that's like a very like a structural target. And it's important too because it's something that's unique to the contours of what you're, like if you're saying that courts will, I'm sorry, like the different institutions that because it's children there's like this assumption of vulnerability. These different institutions have these tight relationships too, right? So it's affecting like, yeah, it's creating this very like web, this really deep web of regulation. Okay. Foster industrial complex, child protection court legal system. Does anyone want to speak to either of those as targets?
Housing. I want to spit, but can you add housing on there
Yeah, as a target or
as a
a
target?
say more.
So I know I had changed policy back in Riverside. They had been putting kids out that went to juvenile hall, right? But they were allowing kids who were in foster care to be out of the home 180 days. So they gave parents 180 days to get their kids out of foster care, or they would be off the housing list. So I just think between the private and public sector, um, and that's another reason why a lot of parents are not getting their kids because they don't have housing.
That's
Or
crazy.
So I want to throw the, the general criminalization of poverty.
Yes.
How about mandated reporting?
Say more. What is that?
Well, we know that mandated reporting doesn't keep kids safe or make them safer. And yet many hide behind liability or the law to over-report Black and brown children and families who are then over-investigated, over-removed, and pipelined into all those negative outcomes that we know are out there.
So, can you tell me again? Apologies. I wish I knew more about this, but I don't. Who are the I'm guessing teachers, right?
Anybody, it depends on the state. Anybody who works with a child in some states, and in other states, very specific roles.
In California, if you got your kids got 6 cavities, they can call on you.
Yeah.
I
So
swear.
the main reporters are education and medical.
Okay, so this identity of mandatory reporter, right?
Yeah.
It actually like scares people into thinking that they have to because they're going to be held liable.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
That
Yeah. Better safe than sorry. There you go. Some states, yeah.
Private and public hospitals.
so these are all important, but I'm like a visual processor, so I'm highlighting some of them that I want to go back to, but they are all very, very important. And this document is going to live for you for as long as you want it to. Yes.
Federal funding for family policing.
Title 4, Title 3, let it go.
It's Title 4, Title 3?
No.
No, okay. Federal funding for okay. Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, for family policing.
Okay. Can we talk a little bit more about criminalization of poverty? And the reason why is because this is kind of interesting because it can't just be housing. Other basic needs might be weaponized for this system, right?
Well, poverty looks like neglect. So
I believe all of
if
these
I
issues.
can't afford a place to stay and I have to rent from a slumlord, they come check my house. It's all beat up. They think I don't care about the house, but that's all I can afford.
Poverty is defined as neglect.
Poverty is defined as okay. As defined as okay. I
I
think
say it looks like.
I see. Okay, and then what about like okay, and then somebody said cavities, so like medical care, right?
Yeah, what is that? Medical. I've seen a parent, a young lady, and her old man have a baby, and the baby had heart problems, and they seen him, the baby mama and the baby daddy, getting into it, and he left, and they called the CPS and said she couldn't take care of the baby by herself, and she was already in foster care. The dad had to get her out of foster care, so they just, and it was really bad.
Prenatal care. Black women don't have access to prenatal care and then are also penalized for not doing prenatal care. Also,
They're overly tested and
domestic
reported.
violence victims are who've gone to support their viewers. They step in for domestic violence and youth children because the white woman won't do it.
They had to tell her 6 times.
Yeah. Yeah.
When they're
And then they
caught
just
too,
lose
because
the
if they
mother
do
with the
report,
abuse.
then it's a CPS report as well. So they're damned either way.
But that's why it's all criminalization of poverty, because generally these issues are befalling upon people who are in poverty.
Mhm. Suffering from AIDS.
Termination of criminal rights.
Say more.
Ms. Angela. You already have it?
Okay, but tell me more. Tell me.
You wanna know more?
The ultimate civil death penalty in this system is termination of children's rights to their parents. They call it termination of parental rights, which basically is a legal, ending of the relationship between the parent and the child, which also means the ending of the relationship legally as well as practically of the child to not only the parent, but their entire family and family line. And that child then can be, is quote unquote freed for adoption, by strangers or other, people, who may be family members or who may not be family members. It's basically the civil death penalty.
Family versus strangers.
That's why
I'm trying to think of like a word
Yeah.
or a sentence for it, right? But it's really not. It's like a bunch of words that kind of come together. But like I'm thinking of like this as like a new age slavery system where they number people, they categorize people, and then they just separate people. And this is exactly what this system does. So I don't know how to say that in.
So there's one thing I'm going to push back on, and that's the newness of it, right?
Mhm.
It's just right, like a state that's built on natal alienation, right? Like that's going to be institutionalized, and but you're saying that like a system of categorizing.
Mhm. Number right, like they add a number to you. They just give you a folder, and then they just throw you into the system of slavery, like where they literally separate children from their parents and move them around freely as they will, as if they have the right and authority to dictate where families go versus supporting families if it's supposed to be that.
Where you said where
Where
children should
children should go. Yeah.
go. Okay. Is there anything that is not represented in this list of targets and strategies that folks want to make sure? Okay, yeah.
I just wanted to add infighting as a result of the categorization and the caste system that we find ourselves in. So it's like everybody wants to belong. Everybody, like what they were talking about before, we all want to be right. We all want to feel important. And so it ends up where we're putting each other down in order to feel better about ourselves. And so I guess the term I would say is infighting. Yeah.
And before, when Kelly was talking about how folks who live in incarcerated conditions see the dramatic manifestations of that fascism, it reminds me a lot about like basically like forced gang violence in prisons, right, as a way of policing those populations and for creating manufacturing conflict among folks, right, and how that shows up in different ways. I saw other hands. Yeah.
Like capitalism over care in the medical field and the legal field, we emphasize like making dollars over actually caring for the people that we're in charge of caring for.
Anything else? Is that a target?
Yeah.
How come?
Well, it's another institution that is working their way independently.
You got to say more.
I mean, I think it goes from the top all the way down to the bottom. Just like universities, and then of course, like, and this goes into like mandated reporting, but also just like educating students in academia, and having the professors educate about these things. And then also how when we, because of capitalism and how we
So like truancy policing. No, yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to understand it in terms that are familiar to me. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. And then I also think there's probably a tie-in between the narrative work, right? Like the narrative targets, the stories that are created out of academic. So one of the things that we think about a lot in the technology conversation is like people who make arguments about surveillance, right? Being very concerned about like opt-in and my right to privacy and things like that versus those conditions of surveillance in which there's no such thing as opt-in because that kind of surveillance is state mandated surveillance, right? Like how there's actually no such thing as conditions of consent to surveillance and technology testing in prisons, right? Because those are like not spaces that you can have those kinds of affirmations. And so like that kind of studying children and justifying the studying of children and that being a like progenitor of that kind of surveillance relationship to poor families, right? And being able to feeling as though you as an academic, as an expert, right, in your Ivy Tower have a right to look into those lives with that level of granularity and to turn those lives into like objects of study kind of and its relationship to surveillance. That was a lot. I don't know where that goes, but yeah, you get it. Oh, I see. So not just like higher education, but also like, okay. Also, school to prison guard pipeline, right? There's also the school to cop pipeline, right?
For both sides, right? When it recruits our kids and when they're still in jail, they put our kids in school. Sometimes third grade.
Yeah, yeah.
They'll be based on how many of our kids are on reading level, third grade. So actually, how many of the children in fourth grade. So,
Yeah.
I want to throw eugenics and family policing
Say more.
because a lot of, like you said earlier, a lot of the family policing systems are rooted in eugenics and the statistics that were found within that, like the information that they discovered in those studies. So they're directly related to what we're going through right now in abolishing these systems because we, like you said, have to find where they came from. And a lot of it came from eugenics. So I think that's a big target, is identifying where specifically eugenics is being enforced within these systems, whether it's directly or indirect.
Time genetics
Like
to
you said, like say adopting people off into families and could completely dis, dissolving their lineage is a direct form of eugenics.
there's a statement that Josie made when we were doing our call about this, and she was just like, "Who has a right to motherhood?" And that just like stuck with me, right? Because there are people who lose that right because of how their children are taken from them, or even like they're forced into like a life of incarceration and things like that. So
On that white saviorism,
say more.
the flip side of eugenics, in that there are individuals who think they are deserving of raising young children of color more than the mothers that those children belong to.
It's sickening.
Okay, say more. Who forced? Sorry, say this one more time. Which to white savior? Okay. Okay. That reinforce that parent. Okay, awesome. So now that we have this huge list of targets, and I want to pause for a second to make sure it's pretty clear that relationship between the strategies and the targets, and how you start drawing out like what the targets are in relation to the strategies, or if anyone had any questions about that, or if anything was unclear, or even if you just want to, if you have a thought instead of a question. No? Okay. All right. So let's grab some of these and go through that expansion exercise, right? Let's pick mandated reporting because I highlighted it earlier. I don't even remember why I did. Okay. What work is mandated reporting doing? One of the things that we pointed out was that it is scaring people into being complicit in the system, right? What else is it doing? Now you're taking your target and you're identifying the work that it's doing in the world. You're teasing out what its like purpose is, what its function is, what it's doing accidentally or on purpose, but it's doing something in the world. Mandatory reporting is doing something in the world. What are those? What is that thing that it's doing?
It's creating a class system.
Okay. It's think of it so separating families and creating a class system. I want to push further to kind of functionalize what these are, right? So creating a class system is kind of a categorization and a hierarchy thing that we're talking about, right? And separating families is, how would you describe that as kind of like a function? Like what is it doing? Yeah. And then and another thing that I don't remember who said this, but talking about how like the state gets to make that decision, right? Like the state is able to make the decision about the reproductive future of an entire family or lineage, right? I'm going to try and write these down. Okay. Categorizing, creating hierarchies and castes. Okay. State makes decisions about reproductive futures, which to tie it to a technique of empire, right? Like you're thinking about how, what does it mean to then make a decision about reproductive future? It can mean like not giving Flint clean water. That is also like, it can mean arming a genocide that is resulting in 300% increase in miscarriages. And he does that, right? Like that, those are the things that it can mean in relation to empire. So that's the direction that we're going. But let's tease out mandated reporting more. What else is the target doing? Yes.
Mandated reporting identifies product for the industry.
Ooh.
That was deep.
Do you want to say more?
The mandated reporting system is a surveillance and monitoring system that identifies children who are then reported to the system's operations, and leads to investigation, and leads to potential prosecution, that leads to potential termination or separation of children, that leads to families being placed in quote unquote services. And so it's the beginning of the entire continuum of government involvement and use of children and families as commodities for the industry.
I'm going to take something else that you said from here and put it here. You said family policing as an industry. And I think that's really interesting too, because that means that there's people who are making money off of this.
And there
right?
are. And there are.
And those are the targets, right? Like that's one of the ways that you can start thinking about, how are they making money? Who's making money? How else are they making money? And who else is going to join us in this fight? What's that?
It also removes supports.
Say more.
So supports can be a teacher, it can be an aunt, it can be an uncle, it can be community members. It removes that support from the actual community and from the family, and it weaponizes that support against them. So what looked like safety back in the day, maybe like a teacher or even a neighbor, is no longer a safe person. So it
Oh,
removes the
okay.
supports from
I
the
see.
community.
Supports from the community.
I want to add to that. I just want to add the word parasitic. It turns those relationships into something that can be used. It turns into something that's like a transaction, parasitic.
And I want to add also,
Yes.
it actually means that in some cases, it actually endangers lives. So, for example, maternal health, maternal death rates probably can be traced to this. People's unwillingness to seek out supports when their health is at risk.
Oh, I see. So if they think that doctors are going to be mandatory reporters, they're not going to go and get. Okay.
Yeah.
I see. Oh, it's all coming together. This reminds me of a campaign that we did after COVID was first announced, and there were folks who were afraid about ICE database sharing and doctors, and so they just weren't going to the doctor when they were sick, right? Like those, like that knowledge sharing infrastructure being weaponized. And so if you know that, then you're not going to seek that care out even if you need it, right?
Mandated reporting also undermines professional judgment and decision making because it requires those professionals, rather than doing what they know they should be doing to support or provide assistance in their expertise, they're quote unquote required to report a family to the CPS. So it undermines professional judgment as well.
It further impoverishes families by forcing them to take away from time and resources to address the issue at hand. Because
So-
like if they get reported, now they got to go to court. They got to take off work. Now, say they take off work the wrong day, they get fired for going to court because they got reported by a mandated reporter.
So would you say that there's a lot of I'm assuming there is, but there's a lot of false positives, just basically erroneous allegations.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that's naturalized. Like there's an assumption that there's just going to be a high error rate, but we want.
And then the times that people actually might have needed help, their children end up dying or something.
And mandated reporting diverts resources that could be used in better ways. Because of the fact that we just talked about, there's so much over reporting and there's such a high rate of error that the money that's spent on those, investigations and all of that sort of stuff is wasted.
So it undermines child welfare effectively.
It also, mandatory reporting also lowers and warps professional standards. So if a doctor is supposed to do no harm, that's their first responsibility. Mandatory reporting changes what that means and gives it a different meaning, if not taking away that role as their first job as a doctor, a therapist, or whatever role they're playing.
So if I understand the mechanics of this, basically, depending on your state, you can personally be held liable if harm happens to a child based on your professional identity. And so all of these people are conscripted to basically establish a CPS
See
case.
something, say something.
Okay.
Beyond the losing the trust and relationship with the initial mandated reporter, there's also triggers and investigation where like normal confidentiality doesn't exist, and so TCF or DPS can go talk to your providers and say, I don't need a release to talk to you because there's an active investigation. So all these other supports are investigated during investigation.
Okay, I just realized that we're bumping up against time. This has been a super rich discussion. I'm so sorry. I should have kept track of time. I've just been learning a lot. But so we see all of these different kinds of work that the target is doing. And so at this point, you want to start tying that to like broader techniques of the empire, right? So like what work is this doing for the state? I think one really interesting thing, and I'm like, the politics of this aside, there's been this viral clip of the presidential candidate Harris saying that like, and this is about abortion, right? And being like, you know, whatever it is, your views on abortion, that's between you and your imam or your pastor. The state doesn't have a role in it, right? What's so interesting about that is that here in this system that you're describing, it is mandating that the state gets to govern particular populations, right? And their reproductive future. It is assigning that expertise doesn't go to that individual doctor, it goes to the state. The state becomes the arbiter of what that is because of its legal mechanism that it's created. And so state gets to determine the reproductive future of certain communities. Because we're at time, I'm going to my Twitter inbox is open. If you have any questions, or you can find me later, we can. I'm happy to work through some of this with you. But also, this document is live; it exists. You have it to help you map this out and these relationships out. But basically, once you start mapping out what the technique is, you can start understanding who your natural allies are in this fight and bring them in, and to start working in solidarity against that technique of imperial violence. Thank you.